La crisi è strutturale, è nata col capitale, sta dentro il meccanismo d'accumulazione, il riformismo non sarà una soluzione, la crisi è già matura.
David Harvey is a Marxist academic and author who teaches at the City University in New York. His online video course on Karl Marx's Capital has so far attracted more than 1 million hits. In his new book, The Enigma of Capital and the Crises of Capitalism, Harvey looks at the flow of capital. As he says, if we can achieve a better understanding of the disruptions and destruction to which we're all exposed now, we might begin to know what to do about it. We spoke to him in the Marx Memorial Library in central London.
The crisis this time is deeper and it's clearer. It has a geographical movement. I've been fascinated just to watch a crisis that started in real estate market in Southern California, Arizona and Nevada and Florida, highly localized. Suddenly hits London and New York. And then 6 months later, suddenly German exports crash and they're embroiled in the crisis. East Asian exports crash, they're embroiled in the crisis. The whole thing sweeps over Asia. For instance, in the United States, everybody says the crisis is over because the stock market has revived. Well, that's a class bias in the definition of a crisis. It means capital's doing all right, unemployment is a disaster, and the number of people who are out of work or needing better jobs is close to a fifth of the American population. The way my analysis works is to say that in the same way that capital shifts the crisis around geographically, so the crisis moves from one manifestation to another. So 1 minute the crisis can look like it's a profit squeeze because capital is weak relative to labour. Nobody would attribute this crisis we're in to the idea that labour has too much power. I haven't heard greedy unions blamed this time around. It's fantastic, actually, as opposed to the 1970s when everybody blamed greedy unions. So back then you could say, well, the crisis really was in the labour market and in shop floor discipline, and since then, of course, we've had the mass disciplining of the working classes by offshoring and by technological change, and then, of course, if that didn't work, you invented people like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and General Pinochet to do it violently and nastily. So you've disciplined labour. But what happens? Then you've got a deficit of effective demand. And then the question arises, well, how are you going to sell your product when wages aren't rising? And the answer was, give everybody credit cards. So you get the debt economy which gets created, and so households become more and more indebted. But to do that you need financial institutions which start to manipulate the debt, and so we now run into, in this particular period, an effective demand problem, which is also, as it were, backed up by the financial power problem. So the crisis this time has a different manifestation. Now, my argument has always been that you can't go to one single bullet theory of crisis. You always have to look at the dynamic moving from one to the other. At one moment it can appear like an underconsumption problem. I think it basically, there's an argument about that now. I think there is a serious problem of that sort. Another moment it's a profit squeeze problem. Another moment it's a falling rate of profit, which has a technical meaning. But profits can fall for all sorts of reasons, including lack of effective demand, too much, So I see the notion of crisis as being spread throughout the system. And I was very interested in the Grundrisse. Marx has this language, which I like very much, which is about the notion of limits and barriers which capital cannot abide. And capital converts those limits into barriers which it transcends and circumvents. And so when you look at the circulation of capital, you see all of these different possible barriers, including the natural limits. Many people now claim we were in a natural limits thing. Actually, they talked about that in the 1970s too. And there's a very interesting pattern. When you get a crisis, you very frequently get people saying, well, it's due to natural limits. And I think that's one of the ways in which the capitalists say it's nothing to do with me. It's due to nature. It's a very nice way to displace. And Marx has a great line about that, about Ricardo. He says when he's faced with a crisis, he takes refuge in organic chemistry. It's a wonderful line. I always like that, you know, that you say it like the problem is with nature, not with us. So I think the theory of crisis has to be rewritten, I think, around this idea of a movable crisis form. I think it's always a bad idea to talk about final stages or to talk about decline or anything in those terms, because capital has been a very fluid and very inventive system. It's been a permanently revolutionary force in history, no question about it. And therefore the revolutionary transformations that are internal to capitalism are still capable of reconfiguring the world in radically different ways. They may not be ways that you and I would welcome or a world we would want to live in, but can capitalism survive? The answer is yes, it can. But at what price? Capital is about the production of surplus value, which means you always end up with more value. You've then got to sell that more value to somewhere, so more value has to be out there that you can bring into the system. So it's an expansionary force. And we've got so used to that that we automatically think that growth is good, irrespective of the social, political, environmental cost. And growth is necessary. When you have zero growth, you've got a crisis. Everybody says we've got to get growth back again. And the minimum that people talk about is 3% growth. Historically, capital has grown since 1750 or so at the rate of around 2.25% per year. It's been its average. Now, what we're looking at then is this 3% compound growth. And then you ask yourself the question, what does that mean in terms of profitable investment opportunities? In 1970, given the total volume of goods and services, it meant you had to find new profitable opportunities for about $0.4 trillion each year. Now, it would take 1.5 trillion new investment opportunities. By 2030, we're talking about $3 trillion of new investment opportunities. And that is a very, we're on that logistical thing where it doubles and it starts to look less and less possible to find profitable outlets. Looking backwards since the 1970s to now, you'd say actually capital has already been encountering those difficulties and barriers. It's actually been investing not in making real things that help people. It's been investing in, for instance, asset values, property markets, stock markets. Those markets are very peculiar markets. They have a Ponzi character. I invest in the stock market goes up and people say, hey, this is a good way to make money, I'll invest in the stock market. The stock market goes up even further, and so it just goes up and up and up and up and up. And the same is true of property markets. So asset markets don't clear in the same way that, say, a market for goods, for automobiles clears. They have a very different character. The point I'm trying to make here is that I think we've reached what in the book I call an inflection point in the history of capitalism. But actually sustaining a 3% compound growth forever is not feasible. It's becoming less and less feasible. Now, what that says is we're faced with a historic kind of choice. We either keep on reinventing new asset markets, which people can bubble in. And the great one they're talking about these days is, of course, carbon trading. So you can start investing in weather futures and all kinds of things like that, and you kind of go, well, so we're going to be living in this world of incredible fictional, notional investments. When I say capital can last, the capitalist class can preserve itself, and is doing. In fact, they're getting extremely rich through this crisis, which is one of the astonishing things. They're getting richer and richer and richer by the minute, while the rest of the world is suffering. And at some point, I think people are going to look at this kind of increasing class polarization and say, enough is enough.
va dentro il meccanismo d'accumulazione. Il riformismo non sarà una soluzione, la crisi è già matura e Marx non si è sbagliato.